Stage is yours.
So, hello, can you all hear me? Fine? Okay, great. So yeah, it's great to be here. I personally love this meetup, and today we're here to discuss a little bit of the history of React, kind of speed running things to cover relevant stuff. This is me, I'm Matheus Albuquerque. You can find me everywhere as White Combinator. I'm a senior software engineer at Medallia. I'm also a GD in web performance. I'm a member of the React Summit New York committee, and I mentor front-end students at Tech Labs. So, where to start, right? If you want to cover the whole, like, a decade of React, there are many approaches you can take. There are like documentaries, like the React one that is like almost 1.5 hours. And there are even live streams that go up to 5 hours discussing the whole history of React as the most prolific framework out there. And there's a lot of topics we can cover. Like, we can talk about the early years of React, including like the past. We can start like the initial pushback that things like JSX got. We can also discuss what's about to come, like the future of React and its ecosystem. And it's always great to discuss our stories with React. I want to organize like this for the next couple minutes. So I'll start from the future, then we're going to take a tip back in past and discuss how throughout this decade we had many times where we felt like there were diverging paths and things seemed like trouble in paradise. And on top of that, we'll draft some closing thoughts. So with no further ado, going towards the future and what's coming down the line. I don't know if you follow the React blog, but I would say at least once a year they post those yearly updates on what they've been up to. This one is the most recent on 2024 February. They posted it, and there's a lot of things promised for 2024. This is Andrew Clark, one of the core team members. So changes to how we handle refs, changes to how suspense works. The compiler that's going to abstract away a lot of the hooks we got in our code. But besides what's highlighted in this post that I do recommend you check, there's a lot of other stuff going on. First, React Strict Dawn. So React Strict Dawn has been worked by mostly Nicholas Gallagher. He used to be at Twitter, and he's one of the main guys behind React Native Web. And React Strict Dawn is a different, and by the way, this is backed by Facebook or Meta. And React Strict Dawn is powered by StyleX, the CSS alternative that they just launched, made open source. And it's a whole different approach to React Native for web. So if you've done React Native Web, which is probably one of the most popular solutions for doing so, we're going to discuss that. And it uses web APIs to render components, and it's based on small polyfills that are responsible for translating those APIs to both native and DOM. And the overall idea is that you have less overhead when running in the browser. I think a great way to start is checking the official RFC that Nicholas put together. But basically, this summarizes kind of well. So, for example, who here is not React Native Web? Oh, yeah, that's a lot of people. So you're probably familiar with what would be half of this architecture. Unfortunately, I cannot zoom it enough. But basically, for those who don't know, React Native Web is this user space library that's built on top of React and of React Dawn and native web APIs. And it shims a lot of React Native components and apps on the web. Skipping through a lot of things, one of the key issues is when you focus on this part is flagged as 70 kilobytes, because that basically brings a lot of costs of UX costs when you're doing web. So this shim overall, and that's by the way how it works today, it has to implement a very, very large surface area. And also it's got a lot of fragmented APIs that you can notice on the slide back. With the idea behind React Strict Dawn is basically implement this Strict Dawn subset in React Native and shift the weight of supporting things from the browser to the native, where basically you, in theory, can handle it better and more efficiently. But do check the RFC, it's got like a few pages of content. The other thing is it started Hermes, that's also on the realm of React Native. So if you've done React Native, you were probably familiar with Hermes, that is the JavaScript engine that powers React Native. The idea behind static Hermes is to modify some of the JavaScript semantics to allow what's called efficient sound typing, which is something we don't have in web languages. And the goal is to bridge the predictable C performance that you have with usability by doing ahead of time compilation. And at the end, you can mix and match bytecode and native code based on what you need. It was first announced, so Hermes itself is not a new thing. The new thing is it started Hermes. And it was first announced last year in one of the biggest React Native conferences out there. And there's still a lot of work in progress, of course, but the very first benchmarkings on performance are just insane. So yeah, future kind of looks like this on mobile. Back to the web and React that probably most of you do, of us do. There's the CPU suspense, or what's known as suspense for CPU boundaries. The RFC for this has been around for quite a while now, but they're still moving, so this is not done. And the idea that suspense for CPU boundaries is going to allow is basically you can force a fallback on the initial render regardless of whether something is actually suspended. So basically, if you know via profiling or via something else that you do have a very expensive tree that tends to be CPU bound instead of IO bound, that is most of the cases for suspense, then you can use it, and then you can unlock the initial skeleton of a new screen. And there are a lot of other things. For example, React Forget is no longer React Forget, is now officially the React compiler, and they plan to ship a lot of things on it this year. One of the guys from the core team, by the way, every month he has been posting a little bit on how some programming language theory and compilers theory overlaps with the React Forget project. So it's getting more and more mature, and its chances are we're gonna get like this year. There's off-screen, what was called the off-screen component. They've renamed it to activity. So basically, off-screen allows you to start rendering a subtree of your app while it's not visible, but you can keep state. So think of it as being super useful for routers or even for tab navigation, where you can cross these tabs and they are kind of loaded, but you keep state and everything else from the React cycle. We now have this hook that's called use optimist, and it's basically a built-in way of doing optimistic state updates, something that we're kind of used to leverage third-party libraries, like whatever is your networking solution, like be it Apollo or be it some SWR strategy or etc. You got built-in support for that. There are APIs that are used already under the hood by things like Next. So the resource preloading APIs that have been shipped with React on, if you head to the Next.js documentation and you check resource hints, you're already using it. And many other stuff, like for example, the new transition tracing API, so that you can better debug your transitions if you're using them as of React 18. And there are many other things really promising, like this first version of React Native running on Apple Vision OS. So people are saying React is more and more everywhere. But it wasn't always like this, right? We've come like a huge journey to get to this point. And that's why I think it's interesting to discuss about React. So you probably see me doing this. I'd love to have your help here and ask you to scan this QR code and answer what were you doing before React, and if you were doing Vue and you transitioned to React, or if you're doing Angular or Svelte or something else, or if you've been using React for a couple of years now. Were you doing jQuery, Zepto, I don't know, those template engines like the good old Jetty days? So yes, if you need more time, I can actually keep it there, but I don't see a lot of other phones. So yeah, I'm gonna let you take your time, but basically overall that's what the past looked like. We had like what some people flag as the precursors, where basically Rails was and still is for a certain part of the community and their community quite a thing. You could also use PHP and leverage things like jQuery, handlebars, and other templating things were also quite a thing. And then we had this first wave of promoting SPAs. And then we had Angular, we had Ember, Backbone, Knockout, and others. And then we got this kind of second wave with where we got the next generation of Angular. That's also when we got React, or Vue, and Svelte, and yada yada. Also at the time we had those peripheral projects going on. So things like Strapes, Batman, CanJS, and like a long, huge list of projects which most of us never heard of. And even creative solutions like Knockback that basically was mixing and matching Knockout and Backbone.js. And overall, that was the status of the community. So basically, positions were about jQuery. People were hiring a lot for Backbone. The blog posts basically going through the state of the art. They were discussing how to optimize your jQuery apps. And back to, yes, jQuery. So I'm so happy first it worked because of the connection. But what we have here, so we got a lot of jQuery. jQuery was the big champion. I myself was doing also a lot of it. And then PHP, Angular, Meteor. Oh wow. I want to talk about Meteor after. And then Ember, Knockout, yeah, quite a variety. Cool. So that's where we all here were before React. Facebook, before React was here, they had this project called PragueJS that, by the way, if you use the web archive, you can still find some of its documentation. And PragueJS was this client, it was super traditional at the time, so it was client-side MVC. And it combined a lot of things they had at the time to address issues in the most complex parts of Facebook. So the timelines, the chat, the newsfeed, and whatever was the advanced part of Facebook at the time, they were mostly using PragueJS. Also, coming from Bode, we got some APIs and features that we still know to this day, like the render thing, the create class that was quite a thing for JSX, and also the whole idea of REST. Yeah, it's super small, so probably most of you cannot see, but I'll make the slides available. But overall, that's what a PragueJS component looked like at the time. And then there was Fax.js. Fax.js, probably some of you heard about it. So basically, as the applications internally at Meta, they grew more and more complex and sophisticated. Basically, those both code bases, they got super complex. You probably can relate if you had complex MVC based or MVVM code bases at the time. And then, kind of aware of these drawbacks, Jordan Walk, who happens to be the founder of React, he started experimenting with a project that to this date is open source, Fax.js. And Fax.js has solved the very same problems that Bolt was supposed to solve, but in a whole different way. So it was much more functional. There was no MVC architecture. That's also when we got the concept of re-rendering when something in the UI changes. And also more and more fundamentals were born at the time. So that's when we got the idea of props, that's when we got the way that React conceives the state. Also, that's when we got the whole idea of reevaluate large portions of the whole tree to diff the UI. And that's also when we got the way of thinking in components as we think in React. Also, something that was going on in Facebook at the time was XHB. So actually, since 2010, Facebook was working with this extension of PHP that was called XHB, and it basically enabled their engineers to use XML literals to write inside their PHP code. And the initial idea was just to have something safer to prevent things like XSS and other vulnerabilities. But basically, overall, internally, they realized it was actually a quite convenient way to write apps. And then we got this very, very popular talk by Pete Hunt back in 2013, when he said, with React, you can build applications without even thinking about performance, and the default state is fast. And that was the second talk about React, and the first one that really made it through and like reached out to a lot of people. And I'm pretty sure that after this kind of moment, every one of us had this moment where you finally had your chance to push some React code to production. As you remember, it was yesterday. For me, that was about 7 years ago, and everyone was so hyped. And one post I do like a lot about React at that time was this one. It's called Pure UI, and it was written by Guillermo Roche, who happens to be the CEO of Vercel or Zeit at the time. And he said, and he was referring to React, with this model in place, the programmer is thus relieved from the burden of specifying the transition between the state or transformation of the UI over time. No need to specify how to go from A to B. Just describe what A looks like and what B looks like in a discrete way. And overall, we got into what some people call the React growth loop. So more and more, the companies were choosing React because that's where the developers were. And more, especially newcomers, they were choosing React because that's where most of the jobs were. And yeah, kind of cycled. But things weren't always that great, and we had many diverging moments where React and the community and React and people felt like diverging. And I've grouped them in 4 different moments. The first one is what I call you're missing the point of. And I'm referring to this post by Dan Abramov from, again, back 15, when he said, I've seen React misunderstood by smart people more often than any other JS library. React is packed with ideas that were radical at the time of its introduction. This created an air of controversy that still hasn't quite dissolved. And he goes on, after a year of using React and observing people learning it, I can say that the best parts of React are not the ones that made it famous. They're not virtual DOM, custom event system, server-side rendering of JS or JSX. Rather, they are a few boring, old, and powerful ideas, which we will get to discuss. But I've seen throughout different features and rewrites and things that React released, this getting more and more in evidence. And one thing is concurrent React. So for example, I had a session about concurrent React, for example, that I even had a chance to run here last year. And every time I presented it, I would ask people, just like I asked you, what are your thoughts about concurrent React? And throughout different meetups, different conferences, different everything, you can see that a lot of people thought it was about parallelism or about workers, or that it was complex, that it was about multi-threading and all of that. And concurrent React is just one example, but this kind of confusion happens to pretty much everything they release, and we're gonna dive more into that. And this kind of thing generates some sort of ecosystem friction. And I think the first example I got from this is traces back to 2016. So when it's streaming SSR, and not streaming as in React 18, but I'm talking the React 16 streaming SSR, it was released. It was super hard to integrate with any CSS and JS library at the time, and actually broke. If you had style components or emotion or pretty much any of those alternatives which were super popular and still are, and you try to string SSR your thing, it basically broke. Same thing with Concurrent React, but a few years later. So in 2021, when Concurrent, after a couple of years, Concurrent React, the whole umbrella that it represents, got more and more mature, and they started rolling out features. Basically, there was this thing called tiering, for example. So a lot of state management solutions, including Redux itself, and even not so popular state management libraries, they had to adapt so that they wouldn't break with Concurrent React, because that was it. That was a new thing. And it's still the case for RSC, for example. So it isn't hard to find still CSS and JS solutions, or even things like a Polo breaking. And of course, you will find some issues are open, you will find some of them have been addressed, but ecosystem friction throughout new releases of new things they're reacting to is not a new thing. Another thing that's not 100% related, but is this thing that, and I'm grabbing this from a post by Ken C. Dodds, is this claim that Next.js is actually eating React. And this is the blog post, by the way. I do love this post. And if you check the community out there, it's really easy to find a lot of core members of important frameworks and other guys from Remix, Kent himself, and others noticing how sometimes it's getting more and more blurred, the line between what's one and what's the other. And that builds up what then later raised as an overall complexity of React growing over time. And for me, that links really well with this overall sense of growing resentment in the community. But that's what's amazing about it. It's nothing new. So when JSX was out there, and those are all screenshots from 2013 when we got React open sourced, everyone just hated it, and everyone basically said they would never write components like so. And this whole thing went to a point that even Vue, they had to write down a piece of their documentation pointing out how separation of concerns doesn't mean by definition separation of file types. That was the same thing when people realized that React is not actually reactive and started complaining about how it works under the hood, and that's a terrible naming for it. It was also the thing about hooks, not at the very beginning, but mostly when both we started overusing them and the team started growing more and more, the build team, to a point that basically people were super aggressive, things like use effect. And people were complaining how, for example, you need about 20 pages of a Dana per mouse post to understand how use effect works. And as if it wasn't enough, we got more effects like use layout effect and use insertion effects for style sheet libraries maintainers. That was also the thing with Concurrent React when it took them 6 years to ship what's a mature or production ready of most of the features known as Concurrent React things. And it is still the thing now with the whole server components narrative. And it's, I don't expect you to read those, by the way, but one of them is by Tanner Lindsley, the guy behind 10stack. But this summarizes really well all of the memes, how it will eventually get to a point that we're going to have directives like use AI, use electronics, or use binary to write our React components. So that's how people feel about the growing complexity of the thing. And it also got more and more popular, more common to see posts like React, I love you, but you're bringing me down. This one is from 2022, but its core is super close to this one by Cassidy, January this year. And I think that one that does summarize it really well is actually one by Jared Palmer from 2019, when the title is React is becoming a black box, and at the time he was mostly concerned about the growing surface of hooks. But the bottom line of the post was someone from the core team, as if someone from the core team said, yeah, don't worry, it's gonna make sense, you just need to completely reconfigure your brain. So all of that builds up to this overall idea that React has gotten really, really hard to understand. But guess what? And this is probably the first takeaway from my session today. Software development is always cycling. And this is a fact for features. So for example, this is a post by Andrew Clark, one of the main guys behind Concurrent React, and he was showing how actually the whole idea of comparing two trees and how React works under the hood is based on double buffering, which is something that the game development industry has for decades now. And this one was then a promo he posted in 2021, how a lot of the cool ideas that React was experimenting from 2018 onwards actually existed in Marco by eBay a lot of years before. So those features, those ideas, they are cycling, and those trouble and paradise moments, they will keep cycling for pretty much all of this innovation. So I think that what's important is what's highlighted in the community recap from 2022, where basically they were like, yeah, some of those paths, they were not successful, many were dead ends that led to new insights. But the bottom line is, one lesson we've learned is that it's frustrating for the community to wait for new features without having an insight into these paths we're exploring. So since they seem to have had this sort of realization, I think that, and I'm hopeful that those travel cycles might get less often. So that was the first takeaway. Starting with more takeaways. So Lee Robb from Vercel, he once posted like some sort of reflection on how tools were pushing other tools. So how Svelte as an ecosystem, not only Svelte was pushing React, how Remix was pushing Next, and so on. And he goes like, pushing could be the performance side of the things, or the DX, or the API designs, or defaults, all of that. And I do connect that a lot with this tweet from Guillermo again, this one from 2016, when he said that we would spend yet another decade exploring the implications and applications of React. And I think that the best reflection we can do on top of that is to see how React pushed us to the future. And Kent once wrote that, he wrote this in the context of Next, but one thing I do like is, he said, I prefer to focus on a framework that can not only give me what I want from the UX perspective, but also give me the skills that I can use whenever I develop for the web. And I'd go one extra mile here. So React has pushed other frameworks with things like JSX. Now you got JSX in Quick, you got Solid with JSX, you got Vue with SFCs. Virtual Dawn, I mean, React did not create Virtual Dawn, but it made it the idea popular. And nowadays we got Inferno, we got React, we got Mid and JS. And also things like hot module replacement and fast refresh that, again, are not React specific, but became super, super popular with it. Not only other frameworks, but also our whole web platform. So the scheduler API, the native scheduler API, that is still a work in progress. It has a lot of contributions from the React core team and even from Meta. And also discussions on JavaScript as a language, discussions on eventually someday bringing effect handlers, coroutines, and those ideas into JavaScript, even though it never happened. They were super pushed by React community. Not only that, but even other platforms. And this screams for me coming from native iOS. So Flutter is reportedly inspired by React. Jetpack Compose is also super, and native Android is super inspired by React. Litho, that is super, super popular, or at least it used to be back in the day, I don't know how it's these days. A way of doing declarative component-driven native Android was inspired by React. component kit on iOS that is Litho's counterpart on native iOS was super inspired by React. SwiftUI, the Apple built-in thing released back in 2018, is also reportedly inspired by React. Yoga layout, also from Meta, inspired by React ecosystem. And even, I also remember a lot of iOS developers, I don't know, back in 2014, 15, they were kind of upset how still a lot of native Apple things, they were MVC based. And that's when the iOS community started looking for Flux and Redux and how unidirectional data flows were being handled in the React ecosystem. That's when super popular solutions like Swift were born. So it's really, as a thought as it might sound, it's really important that we do think that before cars there were no car accidents, and that we don't commit this mistake about React. And by the way, I do have other examples. It's super easy to dash on jQuery these days, but a lot of what's part of our spec nowadays was inspired by jQuery. Who has ever used CoffeeScript? Okay, for you. So yeah, CoffeeScript inspired the fat arrow thing we got on ES6, and it's also reportedly happening. And who here has ever used Ember? Wow. So the most famous router in the React community, which happens to be React Router, it was heavily inspired by what the Ember community was doing back in 2014 with their router that was just like a breakthrough for its time. So it's super important that we see, and not only about React, but that we see how these tags, they pushed others. The second thing, and this is about RSCs, is that just like JSX, it was a similar feeling in the community when this happens. It was going against so many best practices that no one ever thought it would be considered a good idea. And yet here we are with JSX. The third thing is, and again, it's super cliche, but we tend not to see that something doesn't necessarily imply something else. So it's not because they release a new feature or a new capability within the React ecosystem that it's going to be our silver bullet. So scheduling or these other cool things from concurrent React, they don't 100% mean better performance. React server components, they don't by definition mean a better offering experience or even a better performance. Another thing is that React is still good enough for most of us because almost nothing is inherently broken about it. And in my opinion, it's going to take something that is a lot better than React to replace it. And I don't think we're there yet. And so that's why it's super easy to find posts like how React is still fast enough. And I think that one thing that summarizes super well is this tweet by Adam when he said that, in his opinion, React took you to the 99.9% of the apps, and your 0.1% would be something like solid or svelte or something else. I don't know if I agree with 99.9%, but probably 95 or 99 would be. So React can take you there. After this, then you try some. You might need something else. And Laurie Voss, the founder of NPM, he said recently, "In my experience, frameworks never get replaced by something incrementally better. They get replaced by a totally different way of doing things. Web API shims like jQuery got replaced by full web frameworks like Angular. Angular and its generation in turn were eclipsed by reusable component-based things like React. Even the things that are in React, like Vue, are much like React in his way of seeing things." And he continues, "I have yet to see a thing that looks fundamentally different from React growing in popularity. I'm seeing alternatives. I'm seeing you don't need React niches like Lemonade to expand. I'm seeing React but flattened things like Astro, but I'm not seeing some new approach." And when I read that, I go back to the post from Guillermo that we talked. He said, "In general, comparing libraries or frameworks in terms of features seems inferior to examining the model it imposes in the programmer. The latter will inform you about how well your code will fare over time as the product matures and the team grows, but the former one. It will also empower you to foresee what evolutionary path of technology looks like. And I linked that with the one by Dan Abramov in the same year, where he said, now that we're not surprised by VDON anymore and it's being adopted by other frameworks and libraries, we can focus on examining React's true strengths: composition, unidirectional data flow. He said freedom from DSS, but I don't think that aged well. Explicit mutation and static meta model. And in my opinion, most of our reflections should be around these. Do we still have them? And last but not least, pretty much all of those reports around a certain tool's depths, they are exaggerated. They are based in outrageous claims. They have a lot of anecdotal references. Sometimes they lack evidence. And we might get there one day, but this day is definitely not today. And people said about VDON that VDON was dead, and now we got Matheus. People said that tools like Ruby and Rails were dead, and they got newer and newer majors coming up, and even in entire languages and ecosystems like PHP. And if we go back to React, a lot of those posts claiming that React is dying, they end up with something like, yeah, but I can't quit React at the end of the day. And you're probably used to seeing state of JS surveys like this one in 2022 when React is still the big thing in usage, but I wanted to bring something else. So this is the survey conducted by Netlify, which is not as popular as State of JS. And what we can see here, if we focus on React, is that yes, the vertical axis is happening, so people might be getting less happy about it, but is it really declining? Nor as fast as this styles. So it's still growing in usage, as you see in the horizontal axis. And in the same research, you can find this thing that is also around usage. And 76% of developers in the survey said they were still building with it. So this is enormous. And when Laurie was posting about the survey, by the way, he said that the only thing he saw ever get like that was jQuery itself. Which doesn't mean that it can't die for you. I mean, PHP died for a lot of people. They stopped working with it. They moved to another languages, and that was about it. So it can die for you, and that's totally fine. So yeah, I needed like something to wrap this up. So there you go. Thank you for having me. You can find the slides and all the references on this QR code, as well as a way to find me online. Thank you.
Thanks, Matheus. I'll ask Karel if you have any questions from the crowd.
Yeah, we have actually 2 questions. 3. Great. So, first one. I had very bad times with introducing React. My first app was rewritten into PHP and jQuery after I left the company. Did you have some experience?
So you introduced the person introduced React, and then the app got rewritten after it. Not with React per se. I've had experiences like this in the React ecosystem. So things, introducing Gatsby for a certain solution, and then after I left, it was rewritten in Next, for example, and such a thing. Also, migrations, again, within the ecosystem, so they managed to replace with Preact because of Lighthouse and this kind of thing. So no, never had something I wrote in React and that I know that got replaced. But there's a similar thing, but again, it's not about React. But if you want to track some sort of experience, I've seen an effort of so they introduced Tailwind in a certain code base, and then they had to do, because of decisions, a whole effort to take back Tailwind and rewrite things in style, some sort of CSS and JS and use semantic CSS and stuff like that. So yeah, so that's all I can think about, but never had myself.
Okay. What is one thing you would like to see in the future of React, and why?
That's a tricky one. I can tell for
No
sure.
one's aiming for
I can tell for sure that the last thing that I was an early hyper of concurrent React something like 5 years ago. So I was partially happy to see that after so many years, most of what was promised was shipped not in the way that it was promised, but it was somehow shipped, and there was a gain around it, and that people are still iterating on improving that. I've been hyping, so the first announcement of React Forget was in 2021. So because they're making a lot of noise now, that's probably gonna come along this year. So in the immediate term, I do want to see how, besides sample benchmarks and all of that, I do want to see the React compiler in a code base that I own, for example, and see how this is gonna work. Future, I don't know. Ask me after a year again. Whoever asked that question, then yes, probably is gonna lead to a bigger discussion. Yeah.
So in future again, in the future section of your talk, you mentioned a lot about React Native. Do you think that React Native is the future for mobile apps?
I feel so bad that I took away one slide I have, but do we have 1 minute? I do feel like showing one slide.
We have
So,
2 more questions.
ouch. So this is before I cut a lot of the slides I have here. So I'm gonna play that again. So this was my takeaway number 7. The reason I took it is because I know a lot of you saw that before. But this is me about 10 years ago at a native iOS conferences saying that Ionic and Angular was gonna be the way of doing native development in the upcoming years, in the upcoming time. So native Android is still here, native iOS is still here, and it will be. So I don't commit the same mistake again of saying that anything is gonna go. And then there was this, yeah. So I don't do the same thing again of saying that something else is gonna comment from the web and go over native. But there's a lot of good stuff coming. So if you did have or you do have a valid case for React Native, I think it's gonna improve. If I'm honest, my last experience with React Native was in 2019, and at the time I was running from some complications I had with native iOS. So I loved Swift, but I hated almost everything else in the ecosystem. I hated having to deal with Cocoa pods and this kind of stuff, figuring out conflicts. I hated how unwell documented things were in native iOS, how most of it was MVC based. And when I got to React Native, one thing I did hate at the time was the developer experience. I hear that Expo changed it and a lot of that, but I don't really know, how it is these days.
Okay. So I'd like to tell you that there are many anonymous questions. So really funny if some anonymous question will
be interesting to.
So please try to sign the question. So next one. What was the biggest challenge for you with React?
With React.
Learning, right?
Huh?
Learning.
Yeah, so I was, if I'm honest, and that's, by the way, another slide I had to delete to make the presentation shorter. But at the time in the web, I was doing some, so basically I was doing Angular and Ionic, and I was hyped about it. But also I was doing, for stack generation, for example, I was doing a lot of Express, Koa, or those technology-based things with templates, engines, and things like that. And also I had some PHP and jQuery, and JSX was against so many things I believed at the time, and it took me a lot to get productive with it. And it's like Venn or Emacs. It for me at the time there was this learning curve that was super hard not to I don't need this. But to be honest, after the first year, I was not because it took me a year to learn, but it took me a year to see the value in it. I wouldn't do things in another way. So this was probably my challenge when learning it. Throughout my history building React apps, I didn't have a lot of challenges that in a lot of them were performance related, but I wouldn't say they are 100% because of React. They were partially because of React and because of some inner workings of it, but also addressing it had to do with that. So yes, I do have lots of performance related challenges, but they were addressed and they were not 100% because of React. And we can talk about each one of them, whoever asked this. Yes.
Okay.
How many more questions do you have?
3.
Okay. So let's speed up a bit, and then whoever asks can come to Matheus during the break and ask for details. So go ahead and read. The answer would be just quick, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
I will try my best.
We continue.
Yeah.
Perfect. What would you recommend to people hesitant using React? What would be the current selling point?
I think these days, I mean, it depends on the profile of people you need to address. If those are developers reluctant, then it depends on what those developers are used to. If they are managers, I mean, if you're trying to convince your manager of a certain rewrite or this kind of thing, then ecosystem, I guess. If those are developers, you really need to see. I mean, if they're complaining about performance, then you need to show. If you do, for one of the last slides was like how React will do your 99%, and then from there you might need something else. So if you can prove that this person is concerned about performance and React does suffice, React is enough, then it is the selling point. But it really depends on what the person is concerned about in their profile. If they're developers, if they're managers, if there are few things that are just hard to sell, and entire rewrites of applications are one of them. So also having gradual approaches. So I do have another session that I show how basically I came up with a gradual approach of it's not about selling React, but it's about selling a long-term rewrite and how you can do this in gradual steps. And so if you can show that you're trying to sell React and you will revamp your app to use React, if you can show that you can do this in the longer run, maybe, yeah. But it's super specific to what you have. And again, same thing. Let's talk with you. Tell me what your case is.
Okay. So, as you said that PHP has died for many, don't you feel that the React Native has also died and Flutter is now replacing it as the go-to cross-platform solution?
I don't think, but that's super abstract. That's definitely not my knowledge thing to opinionate on, to be honest. Like I've seen like companies I work with for rewriting their stacks from React Native into Flutter, but if you ask me, I don't have data to back this up, so I don't know how state of mobile development are going to see if that's actual a market trade. It's at the end of the day, it's in opinion of me and coming from me in this sense is super anecdotal in the sense that it's just what I've seen in the companies I'm around, but I don't have market data nor ecosystem data to back this up.
The last one?
The last one is similar to one of previous. So, apart from the ecosystem strength of React, what do you think is the main advantage of React and forget compiler versus signal-based frameworks?
So detaching the React compiler of the thing, one thing, and I was discussing this recently with a friend. I think that the fact that the components you write at the end of the day, they turn into React trees that can be rendered by React DOM, React Native, server alternatives, PDF, or so I think that having a render architecture that is detached from the thing. So React components render to the DOM, they render to PDF, they render to PSP devices because there's a React renderer that runs on top of low memory devices. They render on entire sets of smart TVs because you can build React renders that target these. So I don't think that's the only thing I would highlight, but having this model where your components can have different targets, and I think it's one of them. I am yet to see something like this with other alternatives. Of course, I'm pretty sure someone on GitHub runs Velte or Vue natively or whatever, but that's not, as far as I know, that's not the state of their ecosystem. Same thing, even with Angular, there was Ionic, but it was just a bridge based on a web view. It was not mapping their components to native stuff. So I think that was like a very, very clever architectural take. And then where does the React compiler come into the question again?
No, it's so.
And
React plus forget compiler versus signal-based frameworks.
oh, the forget compiler. Oh, I don't think it's gonna take back to the 1% thing. So it's not like the React compiler is gonna make React signal-based or anything like this. It's not gonna change the way how virtual DOM works for React. It's not gonna change the way how he compares the necessary stuff, even though if they do a lot of data structure and algorithm-based optimizations under the hood to optimize that. So if you, via benchmarks and via everything else, figure out that something like Solid or React Signals are faster, and you need that sort of fastness, then go for it. React compiler, React Forget, in my opinion, is gonna be more of, especially a convenience for legacy code bases where you cannot migrate a lot of stuff, or to code bases that didn't even get a chance to use Mimo, use callback, and all those optimization performance escape hatches that come in sort of hooks or high order components like the Mimo high order component. So I wouldn't say it replaces. And if you are in this 1% for performance, then go with Signals, with something like Solid. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much.